This is an interview with Richard Breeden for the SEC Historical Society's Virtual Museum and Archive on the history of financial regulation. Today's November 19th, 2019. I'm Kenneth Durr, and we're in the offices of Richards, Kibbe, and Orby in Washington, D.C. Mr. Breeden, thank you very much for taking some time to talk.
Delighted.
I've been looking forward to this for quite some time.
Well, me too.
Let's go back just a bit.
30 years.
Let's go back just a bit. We'll go back a little more than 30 years and talk about your upbringing. You were mostly raised on the West Coast, I understand.
Yes, I grew up in Manhattan Beach, California. Went to Stanford University for my undergraduate. Then I'd always wanted to study in a foreign country, so I came to Harvard for law school.
Okay.
And been pretty much on the East Coast ever since.
I noticed you studied international relations at Stanford. It sounds like you answered my question as to why you went into that.
Well, international relations was a name I put on it. It was really an interdepartmental major that was combination of history, political science, and economics. And Stanford in those years let you construct your own major rather than limiting you to departmental focus. I started out as a history major, and that's really been my academic love. But I also was pretty passionate about economics, and so I tried to blend them together.
Okay. And why Harvard Law?
That was where I'd always wanted to go since I was a little boy.
Okay. Did you develop an interest in banking and financial law at that point? Were you specializing at all?
Well, my interest in, when I was in law school, my interests were focused more on, I mean, you don't really know when you're in law school, but what the future will hold. But I was very interested in corporate finance and corporate law and operations of companies more than trying to be Perry Mason. I think I didn't see myself as a Perry Mason type.
What did you see yourself? Did you see yourself going into private practice, teaching?
I didn't know. Who knows at that point?
Okay. All right. You did teach for a while, I understand.
Just a year.
Okay.
Well, everyone else, it's very common. People got out of law school to do judicial clerkships, and that's mostly a litigation track.
Okay.
And I wasn't focused on litigation. And Larry Tribe, who was one of my professors, called me up one day and asked me if I wanted to teach. And I said, well, it was kind of a surprise. And there was a lady named Soya Menshikoff who was quite famous in academia and legal education at the time. And she had been a long-time professor at the University of Chicago, and she had just become dean at the University of Miami Law School, and apparently didn't regard the tenured faculty as quite up to the Chicago standards. And so, as Tribe explained it to me, she was going to set up a program with 6 or 7 immediate past graduates of law schools from good schools, and send more people on sabbatical and throw the kids into not legal research and methods, but into frontline courses as a temporary expedient. And it was pitched as it was not a tenure track. I would have had zero interest in at that point in my career in trying to go right into academia. But I did think it would be fun to see how I'd like teaching might come in handy down the line. And so I did it.
What did you take away from that experience?
Well, I enjoyed it. I enjoyed it a lot. I taught constitutional law, taught a class in 14th Amendment, and federal jurisdiction, which I had only taken the previous semester in my 3rd year at Harvard, so my notes were fresh. In fact, I found out I was going to teach it halfway through the course, so my notes got much better. But it was fun. It was a good way to spend a year.
How did you end up in Washington, D.C.?
I can't remember whether I took the train or it was, I got an opportunity to come down and work in, right after Reagan was elected. And it was a difficult decision. I was I was in the zone of where you would come up for partner in another year or two or three. And so going and doing something else was a lot of uncertainties involved in that. But I'd had a passion for politics my whole life. And it wasn't a position dealing with politics per se, but being in government. I also found that in law practice, over and over and over again, large transactions, that I did a lot of M&A work, and the large transactions very frequently involved trying to predict what the government was going to do. How will the IRS treat a certain issue if it's a close call? And what is the antitrust division going to do? And what is the SEC going to do in interpreting if there's some close call on a Williams Act question? And so I would find myself, and I saw repeatedly very large transactions with huge significance for people in the companies and the markets as a whole, and people trying to assess what they thought was the likely course of the government action, and where the lawyers were had as part of what they were doing to persuade the government of how given set of rules should be interpreted. So I thought that spending a little time on the other side of the table would be very educational and a good thing to do.
What was your entree into the Reagan administration? Well,
I'd done a little work, but nothing much to speak of. It was, but I'd met some people and got a chance to come down, and actually worked as chief of staff for the Deputy Secretary of Labor my first year, and that was interesting. But the real opportunity was about a year later when then Vice President Bush, his general counsel named C. Boyden Gray, who was my boss for many years thereafter, offered me a job to come over to the White House and work for him as his deputy. At that time, Vice President Bush was involved in a whole lot of things, but one of the most important of which was that President Reagan had four pillars in his campaign, one of which was get the government off the backs of the people, which was the catchy way of saying we had too much regulation and it expanded too far and it was holding down the economy. And it turns out, I have long believed this, and the longer I live, the more clear it becomes the deadly force or the deadly toxin that excessive regulation can have for an economy, and the ultimate judgment call that regulators have between the manifest dangers of no regulation and the people that can get hurt, and no matter what the area might be, environmental, securities, banking. There's a reason we have regulation, but on the other hand, if it goes too far, it can then start diminishing the vigor of the economy. So Reagan had created a task force on regulatory relief whose purpose was to review regulations all across the government and identify areas where regulation should be trimmed back, or where new regulations should have a second opinion. They basically put in a second opinion process that has been continued under Republicans and Democrats to this very day, where new regulations are reviewed over in the Office of Management and Budget for whether they are the meet all the standards of being narrowly targeted and cost-effective and so on. So Reagan had appointed Bush to lead this task force, and Breeden was the counsel in the regulatory relief effort, and I became his deputy. And we looked at things all over the government, air conditioner regulations and airbags and Davis-Bacon rules and for federal construction and everything you could think of. And OMB was there was a group within OMB that provided the analytic capabilities. Breeden and I were the link to Bush, who was leading the group, which was composed of a number of members of the cabinet, but where political judgments had to be reached. If you got in disagreements and arguments between an agency that wants a standard to so many parts per million, and the outside reviewers or the second opinion where they think, well, actually that standard is perhaps too high. Instead of here, it should be here. And eventually you can do all the analysis, but somebody has to eventually decide. And those decisions would then come through the members of the task force and ultimately go up to, in some cases, the president. So that was my real introduction to the regulatory process, and it was terrific. It was really a little PhD course every single day. I came to work, and it was terrific because rather than being in a single agency and only seeing that agency and only seeing its laws and how that worked, I got involved in dealing with regulatory programs in every corner of the government, and so it gave me a nice base of perspective that helped me a great deal at the SEC later on. Then after a while, and really not that long, the Treasury Secretary, who was Don Reagan, former CEO of Merrill Lynch at that time, came to Bush and said that he was convinced that Glass-Steagall was going to be repealed in the following year. They had nearly gotten it passed. Congress had just passed something called the Garn-St. Germain Act, which deregulated controls on bank interest rates. And at the same time, as it was going through Congress, there were provisions to also deregulate the assets that banks and securities firms could invest in. And that part had gotten dropped out at the end, and Reagan was convinced it was going to be enacted the following March or April, and so he wanted Bush to lead an effort to study the financial regulatory system. It wasn't formally a subgroup of the parent original task force, which was limited to cabinet agencies because of questions about constitutional authority of regulatory review over the actions of independent agencies. Well, all of financial regulation, or 90% of it, is in the independent agencies, and so Reagan said he could never lead a group to discuss what the future regulatory system ought to look like, because the Fed would say, thanks, we're not coming. If the Treasury was organizing something, but if they were invited to a nice lunch at the White House, they would of course show up. And so they ultimately decided to form this group, which was called the Bush Task Group on Financial Regulation, I guess financial services. And we spent the next 2.5 years working with John Shadd, then head of the SEC and CFTC and the Fed and the FDIC and the Comptroller, all the agencies. Plus we had Treasury and the Justice Department and OMB. And it really was looking down the road and trying to say, well, if Glass-Steagall is repealed, what principles are we going to use for what should take its place? And I think a fairly rare example of where government is actually doing advanced strategic planning. And it turned out that Don Reagan was optimistic about how fast Glass-Steagall was going to be repealed. And our the focus as the Bush group evolved was not limited to Glass-Steagall. That was a backdrop of why this issue had a lot of attention. But when you added up all the employees involved federal employees in financial regulation, it was larger, I think, than the Labor Department and the Commerce Department put together. I mean, it was tens of thousands of employees and billions of dollars. Huge apparatus with a gigantic impact on the economy. But it was very fragmented in the hands of all these different independent agencies and very difficult for anyone to take a look at. Is it effective? Does it do the job it's supposed to do in controlling risk and maintaining stability? And is it efficient? Does it do that job at 10 times the cost it ought to take, or is it pretty well adapted to the job at hand? So we spent a lot of time talking about that and looking at it, and they used to joke, Bill Isaac was then the chairman of the FDIC, and he and I were neighbors out in Great Falls, Virginia, and used to play tennis a lot together. And we would have the meetings over at the FDIC because it's right across the street from the old EOB. And there was a chairman's conference room up there, and he had it was just made in paper, but he had a sign made, the Richard Breeden conference room. We had so many meetings there. And
so you
try and work out, Bush wanted something that was consensual. He didn't want some academic theory of what would make sense. He wanted something that the independent agencies could buy into, that would make the system, if not perfect, would take a step forward in making it more effective and more efficient. And so we spent a lot of time, because you were inherently talking about agency turf, which is by far the most difficult subject of any in Washington.
And making them smaller, perhaps.
Well, the overall effort was to rationalize, not to shrink. And it really wasn't this was not a budget cutting exercise. If that's what it was, you would have just let OMB throw numbers at people. But this was really an exercise recognizing that the system, major components of the system had been created in the 1930s. There were no computers. There were, the world, the financial markets, people were still clearing, using the Pony Express to carry checks around to be cleared from one. One of the interesting questions always was, why does the Federal Reserve need 12 regional reserve banks? And the answer they always gave was, well, the system was created when they were moving checks physically and very slowly, and so they needed them scattered around. I think the real answer is political influence, but that was the theoretical influence. Anyway, that was really a wonderful experience for me, because I knew the world. I'd been a securities lawyer, and I did IPOs 5 deals a week at times when the market was hot, and I'd done M&A, quite a bit of M&A, early days of M&A in New York, and I had actually represented some major banks in banking transactions, and so I had a pretty good feel for both banking and securities. I didn't know derivatives, futures. I didn't know, truth is, to this day, I don't know too much about the credit unions, although they were on the group. But I had never been exposed to the details of, between the Fed, the FDIC, and the comptroller of the currency, and then the savings and loan regulator. So we had 5, if you count the credit unions, depository institution regulators, 4 if you put the credit unions aside. And they each had very different objectives and bitter rivals. and in some areas, but also happy to work together in other areas. So it was a good education, great education actually, in just how those agencies operated. And among the other things I learned was the importance of an agency's culture, and agencies really born out of their history, but their staffs can have a culture that's quite recognizable.
So aside from being a terrific education, what was the end result of the task group's work?
We had about 73 or 74 unanimous recommendations for improving the financial system. And over the next 3 or 4 years, it's pretty typical. When you do a study like that, Congress doesn't get it and say, terrific, thank you, we've been waiting for this, we'll pass it next week. But you feed into the intellectual hopper ideas and things that could be done, and then as bills are under consideration, as problems come up, a surprising number of things will eventually get enacted. I would say I've never gone back to count to see how many of ours, but a number of them were adopted, but not the biggest. The biggest change was to try and narrow the duplication caused by the Federal Reserve and its role overseeing all bank holding companies in the United States. And that was the very worst fault of the whole system in our view, in the view of everyone other than Paul Volcker, though he signed the report without dissent. And basically, if you had Citibank and Citicorp, you had the comptroller of the currency regulating Citibank and a different agency, the Federal Reserve, regulating Citicorp. And that made for 100% duplication. And worse than that, it eliminated direct accountability in the regulators for who's responsible if that organization, you have one business entity. Citibank and Citicorp are not two different things. It's one entity. And it's got two different agencies. One says you should zig, and the other one says, no, we really think you should zag. And that's a problem. And then you just churn with legal fees, and people can't make decisions. And if anything goes wrong, the one agency can say, well, those guys over there, we thought they were looking at that. And the other people say, well, we thought you were looking at it. And it can substantially weaken accountability among regulators, which is an overlooked but terribly important criteria of a system that works really well, because regulators are human. They make mistakes. I'm not talking about political witch hunts or anything, but just if a system is pervasively not doing a certain job, then you want to try and fix it and make it better so that it will accomplish that. So, and President Bush was, well, then Vice President Bush was certainly very sensitive to the subject of accountability and making sure that people owned up to both. They love taking credit for their good things, good successes, that they ought to own up to things that are not going so well. So the task force proposed that that each business organization, the bank and its holding company, should be under one regulator. And that could be the comptroller, or it could be the Fed, but it shouldn't be two agencies for a single company. That never got done, and of course the Fed saw the Holding Company Act as the heart of its power, even though in trade, to get them to go along with that, the task force report said that that system shouldn't operate for the 50 largest firms, that the Fed needed to be sensitive to what was going on in the real economy, so that we would only apply it below that amount, which was what got Volcker on board. Anyway, it was a mixed bag. Some got adopted, some didn't. The two backdrops of what was really going on in the real world outside the gates of the White House were we already talked about Glass-Steagall, but the continuing breakdown of the 1930s market structure. And the banks were, in particular, obsessed with having the ability to have securities affiliates. And Glass-Steagall, the heart of it was that you could not take deposits and underwrite securities in the same entity. And so the banks were trying to evolve a model that said, well, we'll have one entity over here that takes deposits and one over here that underwrites securities, and that should be permissible, and the bank securities affiliate can be regulated by the SEC and the bank by the bank. So that was a continuing push that went on until Glass-Steagall was eventually repealed, but a number of years later. You had that, and then you had the market's attempt to survive the disastrous economics of the Jimmy Carter presidency. So you had 13% inflation, 14%, but double-digit inflation. You had the prime interest rate. When I got my first mortgage in Washington, D.C., it was 16.85% interest rate, which was not a thrill. Since I'd left a 7% mortgage back home, but you had this tremendous spike in inflation and interest rates, which caused the birth of money market funds, which then disintermediated the banks massively. And St. Germain was passed to let banks, then were saying one of two things had to happen. Either you had to get rid of the money market funds and completely confiscate or destroy the entire savings of the middle class, because if you're getting 5% interest on your savings and inflation is at 13%, your savings will be gone in a very calculable period of time. So either you had to put that genie back in the bottle, which was not going to happen, or you had to let the banks compete, because otherwise every last dollar would come out of the banking system. So St. Germain pulled the interest rate caps, what was then Reg Q of the Federal Reserve. Banks could offer 5%, savings and loans 5.25%, and they pulled those off. Unfortunately, by the time that happened, the savings and loans as an industry were probably completely insolvent. And there were certainly hundreds of them that were insolvent because they'd had fixed rate mortgage portfolios in the 3 and 4%, and now they're paying, so you take the caps off, and in order to fund their assets, they're paying 10, 11, 12% to hold a 4% asset. So they're going bankrupt day by day at a very rapid pace. So you had this tremendous instability in the savings and loan industry, and what Congress was going to do about it. And at the time St. Germain was passed, there were about $650 billion in savings and loan deposits. And by 1989, when we finally passed the Bush rescue plan, there was 1.3 trillion. So the industry doubled in size, took the ability to bid for deposits and doubled its size, hoping to make new loans that would yield the higher market rates. Unfortunately, they made loans that mostly became uncollectible.
You've given us a great
You had
context.
Glass-Steagall going on one track, and you had the savings and loan crisis inexorably building on another. And those were the things that why the White House and Congress were very interested in financial regulation, because the 1930s system was just fragmenting in front of our eyes.
Right. You've given us a good context for the next big story here, which is the S&L story. But did you go into private practice then after the task group?
Not right after the task group. I can't remember when we finished our work in '84, maybe. I went back to private practice in basically beginning of 1986.
Okay.
And I did it because in my job in the White House, I was under the Hatch Act. And this was the second term of Ronald Reagan, and the principal thing that George Herbert Walker Bush was doing every day of the week was running for president. And under my job, even though I was one of 25 people who worked for him, I was supposedly illegal for me to help him on the only thing he was really focused on doing. So I left the government and became a partner of the Washington office of a Texas law firm, and where I could do both. I could practice law, and I could then help Bush and participate in the election campaign. I might add, just it's something most people wouldn't know. The staff of the President of the United States is fairly large. I'm sure it's much bigger today. When I was there, it was about 780, just under 800 people. The staff of the Vice President was 4 little letters, V-I-C-E. Well, it made a huge difference, because I suppose our staff was maybe 25 people. So if you work for someone who is vice president, you get to know them very well, because it's a tiny, tiny group. And you don't have a large teams and everybody specialized in their silos. Everybody's got to paint and hang wallpaper and anything else that needs to be done. So I had, over the 3 years since I started in the White House working for Bush, gotten to know him extremely well, and both ways. He getting to know me and my getting to know him. And so, I very much wanted to, when I first came to Washington, I thought I would come for 2 years and then go back to New York and resume practicing law. It was way too interesting after 2 years to go back. So I was determined to stay, but I needed to get, to leave my job on the vice president's staff, because that was a legally a nonpartisan job.
So you helped with the campaign?
Yes. I was Jack Kemp.
Give me a little more.
Well, I mean, in the debates, I did a lot of things. I ran the policy, a good deal of the policy operation in the campaign, but we also, in debate preparations, a staple. I went to a thing the other night. I think there have only been 3 presidential elections since the 1960s where there were no debates, and they've become more and more critical in the selection process. But so I was Jack Kemp for the better part of a year, and meant I read everything all his speeches, and watched all the video, and so when we would have a practice debate, that I could give answers that would be as close as possible to what the real Jack Kemp would be likely to say. Later on, while I'm an assistant to the president under now President Bush, then Secretary of Housing and Urban Development Kemp, come to the White House, and I did tell Mr. Kemp that I had been him, and while I couldn't throw a football nearly as well as he could, that it was fun being him, and I really grew to admire him. Kemp was passionate about policy, and a first-class human being, really a terrific person. So
sounds like another education as well.
Well, it was just drinking from a fire hose. But the campaign, I mean, I did go through a campaign at a very high level, and because, and campaigns are huge, but there was a nucleus of people who 41 knew, this is 41 before he's 41, hoping to be 41, who he knew really well, so that he could trust. And on policy issues, we were kind of a natural bridge between, and when you're a sitting vice president running, you're saddled with, it can be good or bad, but you're saddled with, your opponents are going to saddle you with everything your administration did. And anything you propose doing in your campaign that's contradictory to what the previous administration of which you were a part, you're going to have to explain. And so Boyden and I and a couple of others were the bridges to, we knew the record of what the administration had done. We knew the deregulatory program. We knew every aspect of what had gone on in domestic policy. I was in domestic rather than international, although I was the person helping Bush when he was put in charge of yen-dollar talks with Japan, which at that time people were of the view that Japan's trade surplus was abnormally, unnaturally large because of favorable currency rates, and Bush was part of the team leading negotiations with them, and I'd gotten to know then a lot of people in the Ministry of Finance in Japan, who I later worked with at the SEC, but I actually first met them when I was in the White House.
Is Bush putting together task forces for these sorts of things, or is it just, handing out tasks to individual people?
I'm not sure I understand. I mean, it's some of both, I suppose. I mean, the Presidential Task Force on Regulatory Relief that began in 1981, 2 weeks after inauguration, that was formalized in an executive order.
Right.
And it was an official entity that the executive order set up along with the Office of Information and Regulatory Affairs in OMB. Other issues come up and people get asked to be the point person on taking a look at a particular issue. Normally, the White House policy structure runs to the president. And it runs not through the vice president's staff, it just runs through the policy apparatus in the White House. But every president will assign their vice president certain things to do. And they go to a lot of funerals, but they do other things, and that's just a mix of those two individuals and what their interests are. And sometimes a vice president will say he's very interested in something, I suppose, and other times it's just the president's staff decides this is something well suited for Bush to do. So, for example, when we were vice president, he spent a great deal of time roving the NATO countries, trying to buck up support for the introduction of short-range nuclear missiles into the NATO countries, because the Russians had just done a massive deployment of short-range nuclear missiles on their side, and then offered to negotiate. And the KGB was busy whipping up all the people in the NATO countries saying, "Oh no, don't let the Americans put nukes here, because short-range missiles, they're not landing 4,000 miles away. They're landing fairly close, and you don't want to become the battleground, and so throw out in your parliamentary elections, throw the party out, get rid of these missiles." And Reagan and Bush, the position of the American government was, the Russians have already put these in. The only way we will get Europe, we want to see Europe with no short-range nuclear missiles, not just one-sided. And the only way to do that is we have to show the Soviets we're prepared to match them. And therefore, if we do, maybe they'll agree to take them out. So Bush, who was a former head of the CIA and a former ambassador to China, or head of the liaison office, had tremendous diplomatic experience that nobody in the Reagan team had. I mean, not just President Reagan, but none of his senior staff had anything like George Bush's knowledge and experience and judgment and facility for those diplomatic things. So that was not something embedded in an executive order, but it was simply, George, saddle your horse, get over there and keep Denmark NATO.
Let's take it down a level, though. Now you're on President Bush's staff and accepting tasks that come in. As the S&L crisis started to kick up, what was the response?
Well, okay, you've got the timing wrong.
Okay.
So the S&L crisis started to get, there was the Hunt Commission under President Nixon in 1972 said the single greatest problem of the American financial system was the rising crisis in savings and loans. It was not a new problem. The savings and loans had been created in the 30s, and it was a fundamentally economically unstable model from day one.
Right, but we got a response.
So in '82, Congress deregulates the interest rates and says, here, you can use federal deposit insurance to raise all the deposits you want, and they go raise $650 billion at a time when they didn't have any capital. So throughout the Reagan administration, throughout the Carter administration and the Reagan administration, for those 12 years, it was not just a simmering crisis, it was a conflagration that was building. And I had, throughout the time of Bush's vice presidency, I was the point person for following this and understanding it and trying to diagnose it. And we had, as part of the, not formally in the task group, but in the discussions, tried to urge Reagan's policy people that, they really needed to step in. Now, this is always hard because the people running the savings and loan regulators at that time are Reagan appointees. So it's not somebody else, it's your own administration. But, there's a forest fire going on over here, and look where it's going. I vividly remember one presentation that I made to one of the top policy people in Reagan's White House, and he smiled at me and he said, Richard, he said, I think this is a problem for the next administration. And since the 1930s, Congress and administration after administration had kicked the can down the road. But the problem was when you deregulated interest rates, you gave an unlimited supply of fuel to the fire.
Right.
And so all during this time, we were thinking about knowing he's running for president and he might win. We all thought he would win, but this is going to land in our lap. And so there was a lot of planning that went on, mostly in the 86 to 88, while I'm no longer in the White House, but we didn't stop thinking about it. And so when he won the election, I then was asked to come back in as incoming assistant to the president, of whom there are 12, we had 12. So it's it's the most senior White House staff position. And it was to come back in and lead the effort to stop the savings and loan crisis from destroying the American economy, which it would have done. We would have had 2008 in 1989 had we not successfully extinguished the fire. And so when Inauguration Day, so from November through January, we worked full-time, 7 days a week, thinking about and talking to people and reviewing the analyses and trying to be sure we had the data and ideas and building a framework. And we were fortunate because Nick Breeden, who had come in as Treasury Secretary at the end of Reagan's second term, was going to carry over as Secretary of Treasury for Bush. So we had a bridge in Nick and his staff of people who were going to be involved in that effort. So myself and Governor Sununu was the incoming chief of staff, and some others, but principally myself, were busy figuring out what our plan was going to be. And you can see the results. I mean, we all went to Camp David, I think it was the second weekend after inauguration, for the president to make his final decisions. We had given him, back in December, I'd given him a series of briefing papers, and more importantly than briefing papers, decision papers of options of what you're going to do. The scale of the crisis, I think, was still, I mean, we did such a good job eliminating the crisis that people forget how dangerous it was, but there were 110 million Americans who had insured deposits, 1.3 trillion in insured deposits in 1989 dollars in savings and loan institutions backed by an insurance fund that had 3 billion in cash backing nearly 2 trillion in, you know, billions backing trillions. That's not enough. And the FSLIC had a statutory line of authority to borrow from the Treasury, capped at $750 million, which would not handle even one large savings and loan closure. There was a nationwide silent run going on. They were, and as a group, they were losing $30 to $40 billion a month at that point. And the cupboard was empty after years of in the second Reagan term, when the savings and loan regulator kept trying to merge insolvent institutions. But the number of insolvent firms was going up, not down, because they were now paying triple the interest rates they used to pay. Their cost of money was very high. And they were losing money hand over fist in all these new loans. When they tried to go out and enter new markets, well, not surprisingly, if you don't know an area like commercial lending and you do it for the first time, you make a lot of mistakes. And then we had a national real estate crisis, and that was the real killer after tax reform in 1986, which took away a lot of the tax benefits for every industry, including real estate. There was a huge slump in commercial real estate. So the savings loans, which had poured their money into real estate loans, get whacked again. So in the aggregate, there were hundreds of billions of dollars of troubled assets sitting on the books of savings and loans being financed by very high pricey deposits. And so that was what we set out to cure. And 3 weeks into his administration, we came back from Camp David. The president made his decisions, and we announced the program in late January or early February. So record speed to have a massive legislative program announced 3 weeks into a president's tenure. And we then we wrote the legislation and went to Congress, and it was signed in the Rose Garden that August. And
you make it sound so easy.
It worked out well, but it was not easy every step along the way. But I think, you know, people, hopefully history will recognize the incredible skill and character of George Bush as president. And he'd served in the House of Representatives. He was bipartisan to the bottom of his shoes. He did not believe, and in fact he told us just before inauguration, warned the senior staff. He said, I was not elected to be president of the Republicans. I was elected to be president of the United States. All the people, and your job as my staff is to find the best ideas in America, and I don't care who thought them up, to solve our problems. And his combination of a new president and a honeymoon period and a person that was widely respected on the Hill enabled us to pass that legislation with huge bipartisan majorities. And we then created the Resolution Trust Corporation, and we issued tens of billions in bonds to pay the costs of closing the savings and loans. And for the first time in American history, financial history, we actually solved a problem. And we solved it once and for all, for good, finally, permanently. Bush used to look at me in the White House and say, Richard, whatever you put in this plan, it had better work, and I don't want to have to come back and do this again. So solve this problem. He was very adamant that instead of trying to minimize the pain and minimize and just do barely enough, he said, no, put the fire out, and I don't care what it takes, but get it done. Because if I have to be able to look the public in the eye and say, this problem is done, and it's not going to bite us again. And whatever it costs, it's tragedy, it's the legacy of decades, literally, of mismanagement. But let's get it fixed.
Were there hurdles in Congress that you had to get past with this?
There are always hurdles. You can't pass legislation without hurdles.
Well, I guess I'm getting to, did this give you more experience working with Congress?
Oh, I worked with Congress. So we announced the plan in January. And at that point, it was a fairly compact set of principles. We then gathered together all the general counsels of the agencies. The plan was 18 pages when it came out of my typewriter. I still used a manual typewriter in those days. And so it was 18 pages, single-spaced. We gathered together all the general counsels of all the agencies that had been the Bush Task Group. We put them in a room in the Treasury. We fed pizzas under the door for 3 weeks. And out came the legislative language, which was about 340 pages. And when it came back from Capitol Hill, it was 1,285 pages or something like that. So, 1,800 pages. I used to say there were about 1,500 pages in there that I didn't vouch for. Our 300, I definitely would vouch for. But so from March, when we, I think, first sent the bill up, to August, when we signed it, I spent most of my time working with Congress and all the different committees. And the bill was very broad gauge. It created a new regulator. It created a new insurance fund. It redid the financing for deposit insurance. It passed widespread new criminal penalties for fraud on insured banks. It tried to plug some of the chronic regulatory problems of regulatory accounting principles I won't belabor our history here with the sad saga of regulatory accounting principles, other than to say no country should ever want them. But it covered a huge amount of ground, which meant that we had more than half the committees in the Congress with jurisdiction over parts of the bill. So I spent a huge amount of time up on the Hill trying to walk people through what we were doing and why, and answer their questions and talk about alternatives. And so and it was a very enjoyable experience, actually, for me. It was hard work, but I made a lot of friends on the Hill, of people who saw it as a huge national problem, and this was an opportunity for Congress to step forward. We couldn't do it administratively. It had to be done with legislation. Congress had to act. And more importantly, I think many of the members believed that it was time that Congress should act. And I think the outcome was something everybody was proud of to this day.
Well, let's work our way toward the commission. Were you keeping a close eye on the SEC? Was the possibility that you would end up in the chairman's seat, did it ever go through your mind?
No. I had the savings and loan crisis, and I was also in charge of the cleanup of the Alaska oil spill. So I had my hands full, and when I wasn't doing that, I was supposed to worry about border security, although I really didn't have time to get much into border security. And I also, whenever there was an oil spill or an environmental problem, I was within the White House. You have different agencies that staff members kind of have to worry about. I had to worry about FEMA and NASA and immigration. Not immigration in the debates we have now, but really physical border security. We weren't trying to build a wall then, but border security is an issue for any country, and was then, is now. So I wasn't worried about the SEC. My only contact with it at that stage in the White House was that I informally, because of all the time I'd spent, one of my jobs on the senior staff was to vet all the appointments going into financial agencies. So presidential personnel did all the work, but before somebody would be appointed to run one of those agencies, there would be a smell test from a policy perspective of whether the person was consistent with the president's views. So there had been a search going on for the heads of all the agencies. I mean, you have a turnover in administration, and President Bush was pretty was fairly adamant that he didn't want. He prized the holdover Reagan appointees. He wanted to. They were his friends. They were his colleagues. He admired the job they'd done, but he believed it was time to turn over a new leaf. That President Reagan was no longer president. There was a new president. That he should bring in new blood. And so the heads of every agency were gradually being replaced. And so I used to sit in on, not always financial agencies, but there were two of us who were in charge of domestic policy. And so the domestic policy agencies, I didn't have anything to do with appointments at the Defense Department or State Department, but things in the domestic economy, in addition to the pure presidential personnel, there would be a vetting, not a vetting is maybe too strong, but exposure of potential candidates in senior jobs.
Okay, so you'd seen the SEC from that perspective.
Well, I wasn't, at that time, I wasn't looking at the SEC per se. I just knew a couple of people came up.
Right.
A couple names surfaced, and each time they got shot down, not in the White House. We did have a Treasury Secretary who was former head of a securities firm and had very definite opinions about persons who should lead the SEC or were qualified to lead the SEC. So, I had a couple of people, names had gotten close and not made it over the goal line. But.
Well, tell me about how you found out that you were under consideration for that post.
Well, I talked to the president about it. I saw the president every single day.
Okay.
And,
Had
they
David
talk about
Gruber-
open door policies. Yeah. I could go see the president whenever I wanted. Sometimes I felt like trying to hide. The Alaska oil spill was one of those events. We had the Exxon Valdez skipper decides to put the tanker up on a reef in the middle of pristine wilderness, but 8 hours from the nearest human habitation. And it took a couple days before it burst on the national consciousness of the scale of this disaster and the fish and the wildlife and the scenery and then 41 being 41, it's, well, let's get this fixed. And so I was in charge of, in the White House, of coordinating that effort. And, we'd have a meeting, and I remember one day early on, we had a meeting in the Oval, and we're talking about it. I actually brought a naval chart, laid it on the floor in the Oval Office to show them where this was, because it was not easy to get at. And the meeting ended, about 45 minutes later, phone rings, it's the president. Well, Richard, how's the cleanup going? He said, well, Mr. President, we're just about the same as it was when we spoke 45 minutes ago, is what you want to say. I had to phrase it a little differently, but so I was completely busy and focused on the savings and loan stuff with Alaska and some other things thrown in. So I was not really paying attention to anything other than
Okay, well, once
those
you had the
things going
discussion,
on.
once
So,
you had the discussion.
let's go to the SEC, and I'm now, President told me he thought my going over there made a lot of sense, and so it came to be.
Why did it make a lot of sense to him? Did he talk to you about what?
Unfortunately,
his vision?
I wish you could ask him, but you'd have to ask him.
Yeah.
He had worked with me for 10 or 11 years. He had seen me solve the greatest financial crisis since 1934. I don't know what other reasons he might have had.
Did he talk to you about what he wanted to see in the SEC?
Yes. The day before I went over there, after I got confirmed.
Okay.
We're down in the White House mess and having lunch. And I think Jim Baker was there. And we're having lunch, and I said to the president, Baker got up to go talk to Gorbachev or someone, and I said to the president, you know, Mr. President, I got confirmed, as you know, and tomorrow's my first day. Then I think it was a goodbye lunch or something, but it was just 2 or 3 of us, and I said, you know, there's these Mission Impossible movies, and they start with this tape, and you put the tape in, and it tells you the mission, and then it self-destructs. And I said, you know, as of tomorrow, I'm going to be running an independent agency, and you're not supposed to give me orders, but we've never really talked about the mission, and maybe this would be a good time if you want to give me any instructions. I don't remember the exact words, but it was, we were kind of joking. And he thought for a little bit, and he said, well, he'd worked with me for all this time. He had total confidence in my judgment, total confidence in my knowledge of the issues and the markets, and he wanted me to use the good judgment he knew I had to do whatever I felt was the right thing. He said, don't worry about politics. Don't worry about who's going to think you're popular or not popular. He said, do the right thing. And if you do that, he said, you're going to do a great job, and I'm going to be very proud of you. And that was the extent of any direction I had from him. He did also say that he was sending me over to have me lead the commission, not to have them lead me. And that always stuck with me. And he said that Bush is, I think, one of the greatest. I think history over time will rate him very highly. He certainly, in my view, deserves to be. He was an extraordinary person in many ways. But he'd worked in so many different parts of government, and he had a huge respect for senior staff and for the people who make the government work. So it wasn't any context of, in the Reagan administration, there had sometimes been a shrink the government, some of the deep state issues you have in modern times of lack of comfort. Bush didn't have any of that. It was not part of his DNA. The world to him broke down into people who were competent and people who were not. And of course then people who were gradations of competency or incompetency. But he didn't wake up thinking about people as Republicans or Democrats or black or white. It just was a meritocracy in his eyes. And so it made it very easy going over to the commission, because in many respects, not only the knowledge I had, but the close relationship I had with the president were huge advantages to me. Among other things, he had assured me that I knew the presidential personnel process. It used to, in part, report to me, and that nobody would be appointed that I wasn't comfortable with to any position at the SEC. And conversely, we didn't quite say it, but I knew I had his confidence. The last thing I would do in my life would be to do anything to lose that confidence. But I knew if I wanted to appoint someone who was a Democrat rather than a Republican, that if I thought that was the best person for the job, that it would be fine with him, and that I should feel free to do it, which I did on multiple occasions. So the bond I had with the president was an immense asset to many facets of running the commission in personnel appointments, budgets, things like that. I had credibility where it counted inside the Oval Office.
So,
not that the Oval Office messes around with an independent agency like the SEC. They don't. The Bush White House didn't, the Reagan White House didn't. I suspect most White Houses don't. But if you need something, like tripling your budget, which I did, that has to go through the White House.
Right.
It has to go through OMB. And of course, the immediate answer, I remember our first year, the administrative director of the SEC comes in, we have to submit a proposed budget, because SEC, regrettably, is on budget, and although I tried to get it off budget, like the Federal Reserve, but failed. But it was on budget, so we were preparing our budgetary requests, and I said, well, we should go for this and this and this and this, and he'd laid out some options, and I gave him a number of what I thought the total ought to be, and this was Jim McConnell was his name, a wonderful guy and a wonderful staff. Like virtually everyone in my senior staff were tremendous people. But he was horrified. And he said, well, you can't send that number over. I said, well, why not? I'm chairman. Why can't I send it over? And he said, no. OMB has already told us that the budget can't be more than 2% growth. I said, who told you that? He said, OMB. I said, well, OMB, it's a lot of people. Let's start with Dick Darman. Did he tell you that? No. Name the deputy. No. We got down to one of the 4 pads. There were the area chiefs, and then that person, and the SEC was actually fairly low on the totem pole because the tiny budget. Our budget when I started was $172 million, I think. It was smaller than the budget for military bands. And we made a profit. We collected far more than that in fees. So I was not bashful in saying we needed resources. And the Reagan administration, I think the SEC's budget had actually declined in nominal dollars by about 25%. A huge source of controversy within the commission and among the commissioners. But it had happened. And so the agency was literally starving. And so I was determined to change that, and McConnell said, well, no, you can't ask for that. And I said, well, watch me. And so I wrote a number that was 100% increase and went over. It was approved. Imagine that.
Beyond the budget.
The next year, happened again. Year after that, happened again. And so, we were able to win resources for things like, when I started, the SEC had no email. It had no internet connectivity. It had no LANs, no WANs, no nothing. People wrote memos in typewriters and called each other on the telephone. The number of computers at the agency was very small. The number of information services, there were 2, a grand total of 2 terminals to report stock prices in the entire SEC. And they were sitting out in the hallway, one so that divisions could share them. And imagine, we'd just been through 2 years earlier the crash of '87, and the Securities and Exchange Commission in the United States has only 2 machines to tell you what's going on in the market. To find out what's going on in the New York Stock Exchange, when I arrived, they would pick up the phone, call, hope the line wasn't busy, call the New York Stock Exchange, ask them, well, what's it look like? And this is before cable TV with the prices going all. I mean, it was crazy how under-resourced it was tragic, crazy, how under-resourced the agency was, and I was determined to change that. And I did.
Give me some more things beyond the budget. You were talking about organizational culture. What were some of the strengths, some of the weaknesses of the commission when you came in?
Well, the strengths are, we'd need weeks to go through this
Give me the
article.
thumbnail version.
I mean, the strengths, this is an agency that is unique in all the world. And I'd seen it in private practice. I'd seen it in the White House. I knew it to be true. And of course, as chairman, I saw it even more so. Most agencies of the United States government build things. They build bridges, they build aircraft carriers, they build interstate highways, or they give away money. They pay Medicare, Medicaid, food stamps, whatever. But transfer payments and acquiring things. The SEC isn't about either one of those. SEC is, and now there are other law enforcement agencies like the FBI and so on, but the SEC is really about values. And the values we expect in our capital markets, which are the single critical underpinning of the entire American economy and our way of life. And the SEC was founded on values of openness and fairness and efficiency. But overwhelmingly, there has to be, the market had to be fair to the little guy as well as to the big guy. It had to be open. Felix Frankfurter's immortal quote that sunlight was the best disinfectant. And so the commission, as tiny as it is, had this extraordinary role in underpinning the capital markets, which finance the entire economy, because the banking system, unlike Europe, the U.S. economy isn't run by commercial loans like the ones I used to document when I was in Wall Street. That's a tiny, tiny fraction of where the money for the economy comes from. It comes through the public markets. And so it is a pivotally important agency to everything else that happens in the domestic sphere. So it better be good, because the consequences, if the commission gets it wrong, could be devastating. So I knew it was a very, very important agency. Culturally, it had a proud history. It has a proud history of an agency that, from a birth in the wake of the crash of '29, had created a structure built over time, addressing capital formation and issuers, addressing proxy rules, disclosures to shareholders, addressing trading markets and the stability of those markets, the fairness of those markets. How do exchanges work? I'll make sure that they are serving the public interest. Mutual funds, the Investment Company Act of 1940, which transformed the savings culture of America, was approaching actually reached its 50th anniversary when I was chairman. So you had this tremendous span of responsibilities for the commission. And yet it had always been a very small staff that had to be resilient, had to be flexible, and had to rely on market mechanisms. It wasn't an agency sitting around with rubber stamping pieces of paper. It had to let the markets go, but stop the worst abuses. And big picture, the number one enemy of capitalism is corruption. Capitalist markets, it's your personal beliefs, but in my view, are the engine for the greatest wealth development humans have ever come up with. But the vulnerability of capitalist systems is the potential for corruption, and the SEC is the principal American bulwark against corruption of our markets.